House Republicans are already making moves on a top agenda item, with the Oversight Committee opening its investigation into President Biden's son Hunter on Wednesday. The committee asking the Treasury Department for information about Biden family finances and alleged joint bank accounts between the president and his son. Hunter Biden is under federal investigation, but the focus is much narrower than House Republicans would like. Trump-appointed U.S. Attorney David Weiss is considering prosecuting Hunter Biden for failing to meet tax filing deadlines and not revealing his drug use on a 2018 gun application. The New York Times says Hunter's lawyers believe those will be handled without criminal charges, detailing how Hunter fully paid the IRS belatedly and subsequent liens against him more than a year ago. And citing legal precedent, his lawyers say that prosecuting a standalone gun charge is extremely rare. The Times reports, quote, "A close look at Hunter's story shows it differs in important ways from the narrative promoted by Republicans." The New York Times Washington correspondent Michael Schmidt co-wrote that story, and his book, Donald Trump versus the United States, is now out in paperback and importantly includes a new afterword, which we'll be talking to him about. He joins me now. Michael, it's so good to see you. Thank you for being with us. So let's start with the federal investigation headed by David Weiss. It's extremely less politically explosive than Republicans are letting on. Talk about the differences.
So Republicans have made a range of allegations about Joe Biden and Hunter Biden's, role in this. And what our reporting showed was that Joe Biden played no role in Hunter Biden's business. He was not Hunter Biden's business partner. He was Hunter Biden's father. Hunter Biden himself did go out and try to do deals with foreign governments or, foreigners, and did deals in ways that were risky and exposed him to political liability and political liability for his father. At the end of the day, the Justice Department has looked at a range of different allegations and accusations and deals that Hunter Biden did, and its concentration, where it believes it may have charges, are on tax and gun issues, as you said. And those issues are far smaller and narrower than what the Republicans allege and what they will be presenting in the coming months as they try and make the case that Joe Biden and Hunter Biden were basically operating a criminal entity together.
And there are several instances that the Republicans have focused on. One was a visit in China. Another was Joe Biden showing up at a fundraiser. And in your reporting, these were perfunctory appearances, a meet and greet or a handshake, that he was not involved in the lobbying and in the business operations, which were, I think many people would acknowledge, showed bad judgment on Hunter Biden's part during a time when he was addicted.
Correct. And look, the story here, the story of Hunter Biden is not a pretty story. Hunter Biden was trying to make as much money as he could to keep up with an expensive lifestyle in Washington, so he could send his kids to private school, so he could support his family. In that process, he went out and tried to, make as much money as possible and did deals in ways that raised questions among Biden's advisors about whether Hunter was trying to profit on his father's name and his proximity to power, at least the appearance of his proximity to power. And that's what's created these questions around, this is what has given the Republicans a way to raise these questions, is because Joe Biden, this is his son, and he came and saw his son at different points, and there was a handshake here and a handshake there that Joe Biden may have made, but there's nothing that ties Joe Biden directly into Hunter's efforts to do business.
You've also drilled down on whether or not the Republicans are correct when they say that they had joint bank accounts. I think the New York Times reporting today, as I read it, is that there were times when Joe Biden might pay something for Hunter and be paid back, but they were not sharing a bank account. Is that correct?
Correct. We did not find that they were sharing a bank account. We found that sort of a family bookkeeper of sorts was going to the White House when Joe Biden was vice president to have him sign checks for personal expenses that he had, because White House staff could not engage with that ethically with the vice president. So that there were these visits that Republicans have made a big deal about this individual named Eric Schwerin going to the White House when Joe Biden was the vice president. And they've said, look, Joe Biden was participating in this enterprise. But our reporting showed that what Eric Schwerin was doing was that he was making sure that Joe Biden was signing checks that he had to sign for personal expenses that even someone like the vice president still has.
I want to ask you separately, of course, about the additional reporting you did and the writing you did in the paperback edition of your book, which goes in depth into John Kelly and when he was the longest-serving chief of staff in the earlier part of the Trump presidency, and the things he was dealing with, including some startling information in your reporting about what the former President Trump proposed doing with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, a nuclear weapon.
So for the paperback of my book, I wrote a 12,000-word biography of sorts of John Kelly that looks at his history and his time working directly for Trump. And it tells the story of someone who came in as chief of staff thinking that Trump needed to have better process around him. He needed to be staffed better. There needed to be a better system in the West Wing run, and that would keep Trump on track. But hours and just days into Kelly's tenure, he realized that the problem was far greater than that the problem was Trump. And Trump was stupider, more impulsive, more limited than he ever thought. Kelly later told someone who I talked to that he didn't know they made human beings like that about Trump. And the biggest issue that Kelly was concerned about was whether Trump, who was using highly incendiary language about North Korea at the time, publicly and privately, was going to set off a massive military conflict. And I tell the story of how this chief of staff, who had no one else to call, no one else to really help him, and was spending his days with Donald Trump, tried to get him off of that because he thought that war was a very distinct possibility, given the highly charged nature of the public statements both Trump and the North Koreans were making.
And Mike, did he once talk about actually using a nuclear weapon?
So at one point in Trump was talking publicly. He was saying Little Rocket Man and Fire and Fury and these different statements. But in private, Trump was also saying things that were scary. And one of the things he cavalierly discussed was, could we use a nuclear weapon and just blame it on another country? And it just shows you sort of Trump's limited understanding of such a massive use of power and the implications of it, and the idea even that a president would privately discuss that. A president privately discussing that, and if the North Koreans had a way of finding out about that, it would have really scared the North Koreans to know that Trump was saying that in private.
It would have scared the Americans, too. Michael Schmidt, such great reporting. And the book is Donald Trump versus the United States, now out in paperback with all of this new reporting in it about John Kelly. Thank you very much.